Thanks for being here, and good evening. My name is Karen Irvine. I'm the Chief Curator and Deputy Director of the Museum of Contemporary Photography. And on behalf of the Photography Department at Columbia College Chicago and the museum, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Lucas Foglia. Lucas has a very incredible and stellar resume for an artist his age. He's been shown at institutions worldwide, been in numerous group shows everywhere, and his resume is long and distinguished, as I said. Recently, for example, in the past few years, he's had solo exhibitions at Foam Photography Museum in Amsterdam, the Nordic Light International Festival of Photography, the Headland Center for the Arts, the Nicolaisen Art Museum in Casper, Wyoming, the Kunstmuseum Magdeburg in Germany, and his work is in very many collections as well, including the ICP in New York, the Denver Art Museum, SF MoMA, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Victoria and Albert Museum, just to name a few. I first met Lucas many years ago when he came to the museum to show me his first project, which was called A Natural Order. That project explored communities that live off of the grid in the southeastern United States, and I was immediately struck by the access he had gained and the obvious trust that the communities had put in him as a photographer, but also his ability to make a drop-dead gorgeous photograph. We were lucky enough a few years later to receive a gift of his second project called Front Country, which explored the mythology of the West and looked at kind of places where traditional farming and ranching butted up against the interests of big oil and other industries. And I thought, okay, it's really time to work with this guy. We should offer him a show. I had been wanting to do that for a while. And so when I offered Lucas an exhibition, we decided to show what's on view now next door, which is his most recent body of work called Human Nature. Human Nature is Lucas's probably most ambitious project, I would say, because it spans locations across the globe. And it looks at basically our relationship as human beings to the natural world in both good and bad ways. Bad in terms of our destruction of the planet and climate change, but also good in terms of some of the advances that are being made in terms of preserving the planet, and also the necessity and kind of the necessity of having a relationship with nature for our general well-being. Lucas once said in an interview, "I want my work to complicate mythology." And indeed, as you will see tonight, Lucas makes complex, well-researched, and compelling works that often are bitingly frank, but also optimistic, and that do, in fact, invite us to explore our own human nature. Please help me to welcome Lucas Foglia to the stage.
Thanks, Karen. Can everyone hear me if I talk like this? Can anyone not? Raise your hand. Okay. My sister says that if I could have a backup career as being a host of a smooth jazz radio station. And sometimes that involves quiet talking, which is very soothing. But if you can't hear at any point, just wave. I'm going to talk tonight about my projects, but also about the values I have in them and methods of storytelling. How many of you are photographers? Okay. I'm going to give a little bit of life advice along the way around photography. I grew up on a small farm 30 miles outside of New York City. This is a photograph of my grandfather and my sister drying onions. The ethos of our family was to live as close as we could to our values, growing our food, bartering for everything from shoes to dentistry. We had electricity, but did our best to live simply. At the same time, with the forest behind us and the fields, our neighbors sold their land in the housing boom of the 1980s, and the suburbs grew around us as people commuted to Manhattan to work. When I started photographing, it was a way for me of telling stories about people's relationship to land, and also figuring out my own relationship to the environment, to my heritage, to what I wanted from the world, to where I wanted to live and how. There's a few basic rules I've learned about photography. First, have a purpose. If you have a purpose, it's a reason to be somewhere. If you share that reason clearly, the door is open and people trust you. Second, if the sun is setting, turn your back to it and see what the light is hitting. And third, if you're looking through a camera lens and you back up, watch where you're going. When I finished school, university, when I was 23, I thought of the way I grew up and of family friends I had met, and realized that whereas my family lived mostly self-sufficiently, we still had cars, computers, tractors, etc. And I was curious if there were communities in the United States that lived as self-sufficiently as they could beyond the way we did. I started traveling to the American Southeast because a naturalist named Doug Elliott lived there. He was a wonderful storyteller who would travel through and stay with my family because my mom's a storyteller as well. And he introduced me to a network of people who had responded to the recession at the time in 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, by leaving cities and suburbs to live off-grid. This is Acorn. It's one of the first pictures I made in the project. He's holding a roadkill possum stew at a community called Wild Roots Homestead in North Carolina. It was a goodbye celebration for Acorn as he was about to leave to teach English at an American school in Southeast Asia. And I ate a little bit of the stew. He ate a lot more than I did. I met his community, made the photograph of him, and never saw him again. I gave about 40,000 prints back to those communities over the 5 years of that project. I believe in bringing prints back because then they have a role within the community that's separate from the art world. They take on a life locally. I never was able to give Acorn his picture. But when the book was published, I got an email from South Korea from a man named Anthony, who said, saying, I just saw my photograph on my coworker's laptop screen in a review of your book, and I'd really like a copy. Can you send me one? So another rule of photography is it's a small world. Be nice, be kind, and have follow-through, and it comes back around. This is also Wild Roots Homestead. They use deer over the windows in the winter to keep heat in. Rita and Cora aiming. The families I photographed differed in their choice of lifestyles, but they shared a desire for self-sufficiency. Some of them, like Rita and Cora, dress as if they're Mennonites, but the local Mennonites and Amish call them cowboy Mennonites because they dress that way to avoid the government. It's Kevin's Land, Virginia. Patrick and Anakista swimming. The photographs I make come from everyday life. It's important to me to take part in a place, to work with people, to visit. I don't hide my camera because the camera is the reason for me to be there. But it's important for me that the photographs are part of everyday life because then they have an intimacy in them. What I'm looking for are moments that feel a little bit extraordinary. This is James's wigwam. I like that he was reading the Extreme Africa edition of National Geographic. Victoria bringing in the goats. So this was Torin's idea, the sun. If I spend enough time in a place, and people like the pictures, they have copies of them, they take on a local life. Torin, when I showed up, said, oh, I really want you to take a picture of this. And then what I do is I'm photographing their performance of a thing for the camera, but waiting for a moment where it feels real. Twin Oaks community in Virginia. If anyone in this audience happens to want to live off-grid, the Twin Oaks Community Conference that happens every August is a good way to start. And Valerie with her father's shadow. And a bear poisoned by neighbors at Kevin's Land, Virginia. I started in North Carolina with Doug and his wife Yana and their son Todd. And everyone I met was through friends of friends. And all of my projects have worked out that way, whereas if one person trusts me and they introduce me to their friends, then their friends trust me, and I map out a place socially. For instance, it was through Rita and Cora, whose photograph I showed you aiming the gun, that I met Christina and George. This is Christina holding her wedding portrait that George actually made with their family at their farm in Tennessee. George had been a nuclear engineer in New Jersey. I'm not sure for what company. He met Christina in a motorcycle club. He still has his tattoos on his arm. And when they changed lifestyle and converted to the Christian Israelite faith, the photograph was the only thing they brought with them. And Cora, and a homeschooling chalkboard. There's a few in here actually that I haven't shown before. The title of the project came from Frank in Florida. The natural order of things is when a species gets dominant in its niche, it overruns it completely to the point where it eats all of its food, and then it crashes and burns. In my opinion, if we ever succeed in being sustainable, it will be for the first non-natural thing we've ever done. It's from Frank at the Miccosukee Land Co-op in Florida. Over the 5 years of the project, traveling between Virginia, Tennessee, I thought I was going to find people who lived absolutely off the grid, especially in a moment where the US government was talking about big bank bailouts and people were losing their homes during the recession. I expected to find absolutes, and no one I met liked absolutes. David really likes lattes. And the morning that I went to make this photograph, I brought him eggs from the store and we cooked breakfast together. But he does his best and brings the parts of the natural world with him, so from the mainstream world with him, into the natural lifestyle he chooses. Here, he's sleeping in his wigwam. And Gabriel, as his mom, wears a squirrel loincloth. And Cecilia with a shotgun. When I started making these photographs, I had imagined them in the outside world, but I didn't imagine them carrying me to the outside world. When we published the book, my lifestyle changed from living out of a minivan part-time and going to stay with my family on the farm to still living out of a minivan part-time, still staying with my family, and also flying around the world sometimes for shows. Part of the thing that is meaningful about showing art to the outside world is it gets picked up in different ways, in different places. When the book was reviewed in Italy, they said that I was a radical survivalist who wore animal hides and grew up hunting and gathering my food. And I went to talk to my Italian grandfather, whose picture you saw on the first slide, and said, "What do you think about this? They're calling us a radical survivalist, and we have a pretty nice farm." And he said, "Oh, is it going to sell books?" And I never corrected the article. As I was doing this project, one of my best friends moved to Wyoming. And I would call her and talk about how I was really interested in wilderness and wild places and people who were living in wild ways. And she would describe Wyoming, and it just sounded a lot wilder than anywhere I had been, so I went to visit her. The image I had of the Wild West was cowboys, ghost towns, and wilderness. When I first got to Nevada, I met George. He's a retired cowboy. His hobby is chasing wildfires. So he put me in his yellow pickup truck. We drove out looking for the edge of the flames and got to this hilltop with a smoke cloud from the fire above us. And the wind was so hot, and I asked if we were safe. And George said, "Well, I have safety provisions in case the fire goes this way." I said, "What do you have?" He said, "Well, I have a Coke, a candy bar, 2 bottles of water, a shovel, and a handgun." Another thing I've learned about photography is that if you're looking for something, you can find it. Because a photograph is a moment out of context that we put into a story. This is Casey and Rowdy training Casey's horse not to pull back on the rope, not to buck when a cow pulls back on the rope. There are some ranches still in Nevada and Wyoming that herd cattle on horseback, even though the majority are using four-wheelers and sometimes helicopters. And Tommy, who became a pretty close friend, is a cowboy at the Big Springs Ranch, or at least was, because I photographed him in his last season. The Big Springs Ranch in Nevada is one of the only green valleys in the eastern part of the state. Gold was discovered there, and I got to know his family the season before they had to leave for the gold mine to come in. Tommy liked to brag and told me he could shoot a coyote while standing on top of a fence pole. I said I'd take his picture, climbed up the pole, and then he fell off with a loaded gun, and I took a picture just before he landed. When this book was published, the school teacher was notified because CNN did an interview with me and wrote about the book and said that a Wyoming school teacher aims a gun at his victim. I, talking over the phone, said, just give me a few minutes and I'll get the photograph offline. And he said, no way, I'm on CNN. How many of you eat meat? There's a hand. So this is what your meat looks like when it's looking at you. Baling hay in Nevada. It's a bank loan office in Silverton, Texas. The banker there told me that about 90% of farmers are on loans every season to get through to the next season. And I asked him what the donkey heads on the wall were, and he said he had no idea. This is the local jail. It's basically a one-room jail, a one-cell jailhouse. They mostly use to lock up high school kids if they party too much. It's interesting that in the places I've traveled where if they're small enough that everyone knows each other, the type of crime changes, if there is a crime. It's as soon as people become anonymous that, in a bigger place, that crime grows. This is Jaime, ranch hand. Thomas and Kimberly swimming. And Amanda at a birthday party. The judge of one of the judges of Jackson, Wyoming called me kind of out of the blue. I don't actually know how he got my cell phone number, probably from another friend, and said, I'd like you to come on Saturday to photograph my daughter's birthday party. She was turning 4, it's another daughter. And I said, I'm not a birthday party photographer. He said, I'll see you at 10. I showed up at 10 and photographed little kids with cake, blowing out candles, playing outside in the pool. And then afterwards, his other daughter, Amanda, hosed herself off, and I made this photograph. So another lesson I've learned from traveling is if you get invited somewhere, say yes. It's better to regret things that you tried than things that you didn't. And it's a whole lot better to be interested than it is to be interesting. This is Ela and Bly at the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. Bly is the hand that's behind her, about to pull her in. This is Bob and Ron and some other cats. Ron found Bob when Bob was a kitten, a couple days old, on the street. He thought she was a big kitten, and they brought her home, and she got bigger. Or he got bigger, sorry. I followed 2 sheep herders named Oscar and Wilson across the high desert in Wyoming. There is still an industry of sheep. It's declining drastically in the United States. But the Peruvian sheep herders who are hired, sometimes Mexican, mostly Peruvian, trail sheep in bands of about 2,000 sheep for a year, sometimes without seeing a town throughout any course of the year. When I was getting to know Oscar and Wilson, they had me eat with them in a tin cart pulled by horses with the sheep outside being guarded by dogs. And they'd rip a little piece of like a Vogue magazine out with a perfume ad and hang it over the fire for the smell. And for me, it was a deeply intimate, life-changing visit. But when I was editing the photographs, the only one I decided to use in the book was of their dogs mounting when they're supposed to be watching sheep. This is soccer practice in Star Valley, Wyoming, at the Afton High School. It's one of the most rural valleys in the US. If you ever go to the Teton Mountains or Yellowstone National Park, if you drive south towards Route 80, go the extra way through Star Valley, and it feels like a different chapter of America. So cows being led to spring pasture. My car had broken down and I was hitchhiking. And the folks who picked me up had no idea why I was hanging out the window. This is Ron, the town historian of Auburn, Wyoming. He told me that if I ever show this picture, I'm supposed to share the fact that Auburn, Wyoming has really nice hot springs that are under-recognized by the outside world. After we butchered a cow, the entrails on the snow. There are millions of acres of land in Wyoming that are preserved. Some of those are preserved as national parks that people drive through or camp in. Other parts are used. They're national forest land or BLM land. This is a road barrier looking out at the Teton National Forest. It was the wildest place I ever visited. The landscape felt bigger than me, and I think it's important for everyone at some point to be in a place of nature that makes humans feel small. It's a domestic horse walking towards wild elk. This is Dr. Perks, the town doctor of Afton, Wyoming. When I visited, Afton had about 2,000 people, and Dr. Perks had birthed over 2,000 people over the course of his lifetime. She said walking around the supermarket was an interesting experience. The thing about the American West is that there are very few jobs there. It's famous for being wild. Cattle ranches employ a handful of cowboys, but the main work is in mining. This is produced water from an oil field. Through the Halliburton loophole, water that comes up out of the ground with oil can be discharged into local river systems. Whereas with the first book, I was photographing one community, taking little snippets of life and putting them together into a mosaic to create a story that shares a feeling of a place. With this book, I wanted to create a binary, a loose binary, one side being ranching and wilderness, and the other side being mining. It's a private coal-fired power plant in Nevada, owned by a gold mine. This is Alice, with her helmet that says "innocent by reason of insanity." She used to be a hairdresser, making minimum wage. Now she makes $60,000 a year driving a haul truck in a gold mine. She has kids, she's single. For her, it made sense. Another lesson I've learned is that everyone I meet has a life that makes sense to them, at least for the most part. So even if they're different from me and living in a different way than I would, the first thing I have to do is figure out what makes sense in their lives, how they talk about it, and how I can then relate to it in conversation. If they trust that in me, then they open up and I can go somewhere. After gold's taken out of the ground, it's mixed with cyanide and crushed to make this slurry, coats everything in white. The nuggets of gold that made the American West famous are pretty much gone, and so what's left is dust. And now it's profitable to mine gold if there's 1/10 of an ounce of gold dust in 2,000 pounds of rock. It's an open pit in Nevada. This is Stanley, crossing the railroad tracks in a real small town of Carlin, near a gold mine. A coal-fired power plant with the plume going out with the wind. So the recycling of the Eden Bar in Eden, Wyoming. The wind is pretty strong, so I watched them go through like 3 versions of the Come Celebrate sign. And there's George. George kept on inviting me to his brothel. And when I finally went over, it was because he was having a celebration because he had just inherited it from, or bought it from his mother. And he was drunk at the counter, and he told me that I could take a portrait of him if he made a picture of me. So I have some pictures I'll never show anybody of like George looking at me and then me looking at George and George looking at me and me looking at George. I like photographs that have clear meaning, because I think that if there's a clarity in them and the story that they tell, and if I can make that complicated, then I'm actually making a complex photograph. I don't like obscuring things in pictures. I do sometimes like photographs that show something clear as a parking lot with a little bit of gravel, and yet make it feel not quite discernible. The goal with all of my photographs is to make something that's accessible, but that you can look at for a long enough time and still not feel like you have it totally figured out. This is the weirdest landscaping I'd ever seen, with an oil refinery in the background. It's the only town I went to in the project that started in 2006 and finished in 2012 or 13. And I went there without knowing anyone because it's named Laurel and my sister's name is Laurel. I went to the Pinedale Anticline natural gas field in Wyoming. It's near the Jonah Fields, one of the biggest natural gas fields in the country. It was the biggest at the time. I visited with the welders because they have the most dangerous job. And I had this whole idea of photographing them welding with the sparks flying. But Roger invited me to lift weights with him in the greenhouse. And in the end, again, that felt more interesting. Because I believe that no matter how interesting my experience is, I want a photograph that stands apart from my experience and speaks for itself. Yield sign on a new mining road. And Mortensen family heirloom painting of wilderness. And that book was published in 2014. So this small farm I grew up on, 30 miles outside of New York City, was hit by Hurricane Sandy in 2012. It flooded our fields and blew down the oldest trees in the woods. On the news, scientists linked the storm to climate change caused by human activity. And I realized that if humans are changing the weather, then every living plant and animal on Earth has already been affected by people. So the notion of wilderness in all of my photographs so far felt undermined by that concept, or at least infused by that concept. I started reading views on conservation, and conservationists often disagree about how humankind should best move forward. There's a national park idea, put a fence around nature, preserve it, go to it on vacation. But that only works on a very small scale. It doesn't change climate change because climate change is changing everywhere. There are more radical views of conservation that say that everyone should move into cities. Because if we live in cities in stacked lifestyles, then that can leave enough space for the country to rewild itself. And I found it strange that we think of nature both as healing, as a place that we can go to relax. This is Matt swinging between trees in California. Or Maddie in invasive water lilies. And Rachel mud bathing. It's a place of relaxation for many people, but we also hold this other narrative about climate change. So nature's healing, and it's threatened by us or damaged by us. And the storms that result from climate change are bigger than us. So inspired by first Hurricane Sandy and then the thoughts and debates and news stories that followed, I tried to work on a larger project about how we change nature and how time and nature changes us. I started by visiting some neuroscientists in Utah who are trying to prove that time and nature, looking at wild places, makes us better at living in cities. And this photograph of Kate on the edge of a cliff in Utah on what was supposed to be a sunny day shows her reflecting and relaxing and also hugging her knees from the cold. The result of that study was that her cognition improved, so she did better at tests and learned faster when she got back to the city than she would have done if she had stayed there in the first place. I went to places that are trying to build this concept back into cities. In Singapore, there's a new rule where if a building is built, it has to have twice as much green space as there would be if the land was wild. It's a photograph of Esme swimming. There she is. At the Park Royal Hotel in downtown Singapore with highway traffic building up below her. And even the McDonald's is trying to go green, at least on the surface. There are other scientists countering the Strayer lab in Utah by measuring how time and nature changes you if that nature is virtual. And when I got there, they were doing a repeat of the experiment with fake bird sounds to see if that could work. Rikers Island jail complex in New York is famous for its violence. It's been exposed in the New Yorker, New York Times. When those exposés came out in 2014, I realized I had an in, because I know that if I give a story to somebody that makes them want me there, again, they'll get me there. So I called the jail and said, you guys have had such bad stories in the news recently. I want to photograph your garden and do a positive story about the horticultural therapy program. And they said, can you come next week? And I flew in just as they were going on lockdown and got stuck there, which also let me photograph after hours in this relatively pristine space. This is Jonathan holding pruning shears. And Troy with a guinea fowl chick. I love that he was in football stance, holding a tiny bird on the edge of a barbed wire fence. I believe that photographs are meaningful into themselves and also when they're used. So for every picture I've shown you, I've given copies back to the people I photographed. I've also given archives of photographs to nonprofit organizations and government agencies to use for advocacy. So in this case, the Horticultural Society of New York got an archive of these photographs. We published them together in different places, and then they used them to advocate for the expansion of the gardens. And as much as it's meaningful to have these photographs in galleries or museums, these photographs in brochures that are expanding a thing I believe in are equally meaningful. And I think worthwhile for any project you're doing that's about the world, if there's an application for it, to change the world. In Seoul, South Korea, the city's famous for its technology. It's the most screen time per person, I think, or at least it was when I was photographing. It's also surrounded by nature and preserved mountains. So I spent a few weeks hiking the ridge of the mountains, photographing the city from the trees. The project as a whole, which I titled Human Nature, is a series of interconnected stories. It starts in cities and then goes to forest, to farm, desert, ice field, ocean, lava field. It was a challenge for me to link each picture by content and narrative, to let each story stand alone, but then as a whole I could create a picture of a larger ecosystem that involves many different micro ecosystems and social landscapes. This is Nate on his first day of being a tree cutter, looking up at a tree he's about to fell. a lumber yard in Oregon. In each sequence of photographs, there are positive examples of things I want to promote. I tried to make complex photographs of positive examples. The controlled burn program from the US Forest Service gets 1% of the funding of the fire suppression, and it's the single most successful way to prevent forest fires. There's Jason lighting a controlled burn with a drip torch. This is a wildfire. I also found out that if I have the outfit, like if the yellow shirt and the green pants, people think I belong there. And I've used that in various ways. I still have a red Halliburton helmet from the mining sites. And I think of them as like little invisibility cloaks, like me with a camera in these outfits. Except with this one, I didn't know why they told me not to wear rubber shoes. And so I went and photographed the forest fire, and everyone thought I was a part of it, maybe working for the Forest Service. And I had one friend who was in the mix, and he kind of showed me around. And I got out to Lake Shasta in California with the fire burning behind me and saw dust all over my shoes, ashes. And kicking the dust off my shoes with all their rubber shattered. And I was standing there in my socks looking at a forest fire. So if anyone happens to photograph a forest fire, don't use rubber shoes. This is trees marked for cutting after a wildfire near Yosemite National Park. And Precious and Ruby. I didn't include this photograph in the book, but it's up in the show. And I included it because Precious lives in a logging town with her sister. She got rabies at the age of 9. She's the first person in history to survive rabies without a vaccine, or one of the first people in the entirety of human history. And here she is in her in her wrestling outfit. And Paul, who's in the book but not in the show, is a tree grower. And I liked how his nipple played off his buttons. Trent, Tori, and Taylor flirting with a whole bunch of cows watching them at a ranch in Nevada. And Jose, Jorge, and Luis harvesting miners' lettuce and turnips from an heirloom organic farm in California. And Alicia clearing land for farming. So oranges with ice that protects the plants from the cold. I like that with the forest I brought in fire, and with the farming I brought in ice. There's a really there's a poem that we memorized as kids. It says, some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those that favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and could suffice. I didn't put the poem in the book, but that's why I edited these pictures into it. I tried to edit the photographs to connect by color and content. This is a greenhouse in upstate New York, the Geneva greenhouse from the Agricultural Research Service, which gets its funding from the USDA, where they're developing new crops to match the future extreme weather. These are palm trees that didn't last. The drought was happening in California while I was working on this project, a historic drought. And I went and made some photographs of drought-stricken farmland that I didn't really like at all. They didn't feel like they told a different story. And then I met a farmer who told me that he made a little bit of extra money renting his fallow fields as a backdrop for low-budget swimsuit shoots. And I photographed Dave and Jenny. An alley waving to town. In Hawaii, the longest record of air is maintained about 10,000 feet up the side of a volcano on the Mauna Loa mountain, or Mauna Loa volcano. At the Mauna Loa Research Station in 1958, a man named Charles Keeling measured the air to track how seasons affect carbon dioxide. Because with the growth and decay of plants, the carbon dioxide changes in the air. As he did the measurement each year, it changed, and that created our record of climate change through carbon dioxide in the air. I wanted to go see it and thought of it as like this super advanced, elaborate system. And it's literally like a glass jug in a suitcase, being the basis of our understanding of climate change. Or two dudes with a balloon. This is Chance and Patrick with an ozone zone machine being sent up into a balloon that's going to burst in the upper atmosphere. And that little orange parachute's going to open, and they're going to try desperately to catch it when it lands, or before it lands. If the science is that simple, it seemed to me less arguable. Then there's Chuck. Here he's doing an inspection of a geothermal field in California that now makes 700 megawatts of electricity. And Charles looking at the sun at the only solar weather prediction station in the country. A big enough storm on the sun knocks out our satellites. At the Game and Fish Department in Pinedale, Wyoming, they had the bright idea to make a taxidermied elk and put it out in the wild and catch someone hunting off season by sitting there and waiting for someone to shoot it. After a few months of it being out in the wild, no one shot it, and they brought it back inside, and it's now the only decoration in their offices. And Josh ice swimming in Sweden. This is the hut in Newart Ridge in Colorado that takes the air samples to which all the other air samples are compared. Because we don't actually have a record of air before people, so we have to make a neutral air because we don't know what air without us is like. Uwe's job is to measure the velocity of glaciers by the millimeter. He's taken me over the ice field in Juneau, Alaska. He was part of the Juneau Icefield Research Program. It's a group I really believe in part because they gave me a free spot in a helicopter to bring me into the ice field, and in part because they've inspired generations of scientists by training young people to how to do glaciology and climate science. This is Kenzie inside a melting glacier when I was about 100 feet below her, looking up. And Evan sleeping on the edge of an ice field that is predicted to be gone by 2200. These are the icebergs from the Gilkey Glacier. When I sent these pictures back to the scientists, I also sent the titles to fact check them. And they told me that it's actually not icebergs, it's icebergs and bergy bits, because the official name for a small iceberg is a bergy bit. But I couldn't put it in the book. It just sounded too, I don't know. I thought Alaska was going to be the end of the book because it was a place that was wild. But when I got there, everyone was talking about how the entire landscape was being changed by people, how climate change was melting the ice, the story that we've heard. So I said, where on earth is actually wild? And one of the scientists I was photographing said, well, maybe Hawaii, because the lava's new. And wilderness is technically land untouched by people, or untrammeled by people. So I went to see the lava flow. This is a lava tour boat that's recently been in the news for some not so good reasons. And I photographed the people looking at the lava as it exploded around them. This is my friend Matt's house, a different Matt. There's rebuilding on cooled lava as the ferns start to grow around them also. There's Goda and Lev. I met them because I went to the spot that the scientists from the Atmospheric Administration says has the cleanest air on Earth. When I got there, I made a really boring photograph of plants and rocks on a coastline. And walking away after sunset, I met Goda and Lev on their first date. They were holding hands. I ended up having dinner with them at their community, or the community where they were staying nearby, and asked them if I could take a portrait of them the next morning with their clothes on in the spot with the cleanest air on Earth. And then while I was photographing them, they started making out, and that led to this picture. So the final rule of photography is, as you get all your ideas in order, go someplace with a purpose, look for the right light, wait for the right time, have everything technically aligned, but then be open to surprises, especially surprises that come from someone trusting you. Thank you. Yeah, sure. If you have questions about life or photography, anything in between. Sure.
You gave, so for every subject you gave names. I was wondering,
Yeah.
how do you process-wise keep track of all of the narrative elements along with the photographing ones? Because there must be such huge bodies of work before they even get to still die and do.
Yeah. Well, this seems like they're really wide projects, but there are a couple dozen relationships for each book. Through those individual people, they represent larger communities. Right? So I think a lot about Synecdoche, not New York, but how like a small part of a word can mean the whole word, how fridge means refrigerator to most of us, or all of us. So if I only need to meet a few people in a community and have them trust me, and if I make photographs of them, it's a lot easier to remember. I have a very short model release that I've written for myself that basically just gives me permission to use the photographs, that has people's names and address. And I always photograph that model release right after I photograph them. So if I look back through my archive, I always have the names with the pictures, which weirdly very few of my photographer friends do. And everyone I know spends a lot of time looking through model releases, desperately trying to match people to place and name to person. So yeah, so some combination of having those model releases and making friends, going back to places for years. It does it. And I'm bad with names. No. Just gonna keep on going.
I can keep going.
What's up?
So in your first series, it seemed like there was a distinct drive to not have as many, at least in what you presented, not as many spatial photos as in series 2 and especially series 3.
Mm-hmm.
Was that intentional at the time, or what do you cropped out?
I didn't know how to make a landscape.
Okay.
Look,
Yeah.
that's a cough drop. I got a cold in Appalachia the past couple days. I was actually revisiting some of the people I photographed. When I first started photographing, I'd done portraits. I worked for Arnold Newman and printed for him when I was 18. He's a portrait photographer who's since passed away. I had never practiced at landscapes. I had an 80 mm lens. And so I shot at shallow depth of field, 80 mm. I had a way of photographing. And for me, front country, my challenge there, because the landscape was so big, and I wanted to put people in it, that I made the goal of learning how to do a landscape photograph and try to find the intimacy and the intimate gestures of people, but positioning them smaller within the frame and showing more around them in detail. And then in human nature, I combine the two. So there's both intimate portraits and landscapes and activity. Because with human nature, I wanted to photograph people doing things in motion, which I'd never been able to do before. So I feel like for each project, I try to learn one thing new. At least one thing new. How many of you feel like you're activists? Raising hands, okay. Do you use photography in that? I got like one so-so in the back. Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty dramatic moment in the world. Everywhere you look, there's a cause. And I think photography is a tool that can be used in that. We need to vote. We need to say things. We need to speak out. It's important. Yeah. Have you heard of name, time, money? So trying to come up with, like, in this moment in history where there's so much going on in the world that so many of my friends are upset about. Like, everyone can give a certain amount because their life is already pretty full. And so my thing is, you can give your name by voting, by sticking up for things. You can give time, or you can give money. And you choose at least one. Yeah.
Maybe you can
Yeah.
explain to everybody a little bit more about how you use your photography in terms of activism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
I found that to be really interesting when you were telling me about, like the garden in Rhode Island, and you can kind of make all of these circles overlap.
Sure, yeah.
The art world, not-for-profit, and editorial work. I think you're really very good at doing this.
Yeah, so the question was about how I use photographs in different ways. And that I find there's this notion that someone's a magazine photographer, or they're an activist, or they're an artist, but they don't always overlap. And I find that if I make a photograph that I believe in, I can use it in different ways. And there's art in each of those ways. I can give this picture of Uwe to the Juneau Icefield Research Program, and they can use it to promote what they do to attract more students. He can use it in PowerPoints explaining his science that has a political edge to it. And I can also put this up in a gallery, and if I sell a print of that work, if it goes on someone's wall, that gives me the funding to then go off and do more projects. Because I have the art world as part of my life, which I'm very grateful for, I have income that allows me to work on projects for a longer amount of time than I could if I was working just for magazines or newspapers. And because I have that time and I have that body of work, I can give those pictures and publish magazine stories. In this case, I published this series on the Juneau Icefield Research Program and the NOAA climate scientists with the New York Times to promote what they're doing. In part because it makes them feel really good about it, and in part because the world needs to know that these scientists that are facing budget cuts and possible censorship from the Trump administration are doing meaningful work that needs to continue. So with all those things, from giving them locally, to using them with nonprofits, to publishing it in magazines, to putting it in the art world, all of those things are important to me. And I think of all of those things as my art. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the response that maybe you want from just the everyday person that's seeing this? Is it connecting with nature or exploring these topics? Just curious, some more thoughts on maybe individuals or the call to action to inspire.
So it depends on the context. In the art show that's up at Museum of Contemporary Photography, the photographs were chosen because they were individually complex images that I could make beautiful prints of in nice, very nice frames. And they're objects, and they're windows into places and objects. But they have enough information in them, both in the narrative of the picture and the title and the caption that goes along with it, that someone can learn more if they choose to. So I want the art in an exhibition to be compelling. I want to make you want to look at it. To resist understanding, so it makes you want to keep on looking at it. And then to have enough information with it so that you can learn more if you choose to. So that's in the art context, that's what I want. It gets more specific if it's used in advocacy by an NGO or a political organization or a government agency. Because then they're using the pictures specifically to say, change this, do this. That feels different.
Maybe this is building off
first question, you sort of explained a little bit technically about portrait versus landscape, and now that you both in art, doing both, I'm wondering about the presence of like a person or a body in the photos that are sort of about a landscape. So I'm not an expert, but I do think there is like a line and a history of like the photographic arts that has maybe been a little bit led us into this misleading ideas about nature. So the photographer will work very hard to present a landscape or even a built environment without any physical, without the body. Without
Yeah.
people. So I mean, I really appreciate that you are not one of those photographers who has presented us a world without people. But I don't think you are always like this. Well, this is an example. I know there are people that I can't get also I wonder, think about the presence of people, whether there's a body or not. Is that something that we're considering?
Right, so totally. Like, Ansel Adams is famous for going to the West and making a pristine notion of nature, pristine picture. He was really good at it. And it created this image of a place people wanted to go to on vacation. They wanted it on their coffee mugs in the morning, on their calendars. Like, it's peaceful. For me, it's not real, because people are everywhere. And if I go to those national parks, I get stuck in traffic. And so the thing that makes the photograph for me accessible and real is the boat full of people with the one man pointing in the other direction. So I think the human presence in the pictures makes them relatable. And often I find, if I put up a show, the landscapes without people, I watch a lot of people spend a little bit less time on, for the most part. So, yeah.
I'm just really curious about where were you in this picture? Were you in Hong Kong?
No, I try not to. Sometimes I do aerials, but I try to be on foot. I like it better. The man who's building this house, named Matt, by the time I came back to photograph, I made this photograph in 2016 and this photograph in 2017. He had finished the house and I was staying with him, and he showed me a way to hike to the edge of the cliff, past the no trespass signs, no pass signs. And then we had defined roles. He said, my job is to photograph and forget about everything. And every time there was an explosion, he would grab me and pull me back just in time for the rocks to fall around me and not hit us. And we paired it really well. Yeah.
And the picture in the glacier, it's just so scary looking at it, knowing that you're below. And plus it has this weird spatial thing where it feels like we're below, but then it feels like we're above. Looking down
Yeah.
at the body that seems to be floating. So, I mean, just how'd you get down there? How'd you get out?
So I don't know how to rock climb or ice climb. I know just enough to be okay in most places, but I'm not very good at it. I was on this trip. The scientists kind of trusted me. I told them I knew how to ski, but I didn't know that skiing there meant skiing on 1950s straight wood skis where I couldn't hook my heel up. And so I was falling all over the place. And then there was a woman named Annie who was kind of running the facilities for the research program, helping to run the facilities. She said, my uncle's a photographer. He's from the Bay Area. Maybe you know him. He passed away. His name's Larry Sultan. And I said, oh yeah, we have friends in common. He taught a lot of people who I know in the Bay. And she said, all right, well, let me help you out. And she showed me the ropes. And she set up a system where when they were going down to do the measurements inside the glacier, they lowered me on a rope with my tripod about 90 to 100 feet down. And I could set my tripod up on a chunk of ice. And I had a rain cover. And then as the other scientists would come down, I would photograph them. And then put my camera down and dry it off. And did that. And so without Annie somehow being related to Larry Sultan and me somehow being from the Bay, I wouldn't have been down there. And then they helped me back up. It's really dark. It's really dark inside a glacier. It's all blue and really dark. And actually, when they first lowered me down, it was a bright, sunny day, and the rope went slack, and then they were going to send another person down, and then I was going to be able to call up when they help me pull up, like a safety rope. And the rope went slack, and no one else came down for about 20 minutes. And I called up, and no one answered. And it was the weirdest 20 minutes of my life, just looking at this cavern of blue, because it kept on going below me and on either side of me. Turns out what happened was a storm had blown in while I was going down, and they were creating a shelter up top, and then came down. So, but that was memorable. Yeah. My dad says there's a line between daring and reckless, and as long as you're daring, it's cool, and reckless is not cool. So I try to follow that line. Yeah.
I'd like to know, do you have any favorite picture in your home? I think if the answer is yes, I'd like to know why.
The photograph from this series that stuck with me is Evan sleeping next to the glacier. It's not the one that's been in the most exhibitions so far. It's not the one that's sold the most copies or been in the most press. But for me, it's the intimacy of him just curled up with his face on the rock that was warmed by the sun, with that field of ice behind him. It reminds me of that the world is big. And I think the knowledge that the world is big and that we're also big in it keeps me going. So this is the one I have up in my studio. Yeah.
What would you say is your greatest challenge with this series? What was the hardest thing about it?
So when I described the first projects, I shared that a natural order was one network of people. So any photograph I made of those people fit into the project. And then with Front Country, I had a binary set up between ranching and mining in a place that was famous for being wild. So anything I photographed in ranching and anything I photographed in mining, I could fit into a story. It was a clear story to tell. With this project, I was looking for a coherence between a lot of different stories. And I knew how to tell them individually, and I've published them individually. But in crafting the story of them together has been difficult, and I'm still learning how to tell the story about it. I wish that I could do interviews for a project a year after it publishes, because then I'll actually know what I want to say about it. But instead I have to, when I have my ideas are completely not put together, that's the time where I get quoted. And it's a challenging thing. But the nice thing about art is you can keep on changing the story because it rematches to time and place. And every time you have a show, you can fit it to the place you're in. And you can fit the story into that place. The way I resolved it with this series was to think of the book and the show as the trunk of a tree, and the individual stories as branches growing out of it. And if I think of it that way, then the climate science story grows on its own and can be out in the world on its own, but it refers back to the trunk. And so when I came up with that idea, I was able to bring attention to the book and press to the book by publishing those stories individually, but referring back to the book and back to the shows. And what you'll see if you go over to the museum, there's in the North Gallery room, there's a small side room that has panels with storyboards of photographs, some of which are in the exhibition as prints that are framed, and other ones are only exist there in the show, but that fill out the individual stories that are combined to make the show. Sure.
What led you to turn an MFA in photography?
Well, it was challenging. I shared earlier that I put up my photographs for the first time, and I think of a lot of my photographs as having a degree of humor, and they're being funny. And one of the professors, Gregory Crutzen, came in and said, "Lucas, I see you're using humor." And I laughed, because I thought he was making a joke, and he wasn't. And there's this kind of awkward silence. And they were pretty critical of the work in general, and my parents were there at the critique. And I found out that I'm the first person in the history of Yale University to have his or her parents come to an art critique. Afterwards, Gregory came up to my father and said, "Just so you know, our approach to critique is to be very critical, so students defend what they care about." So I just want you to feel like at least your son's not going to be alone. And my dad said, "It's okay, he'll outlive his critics." All that being said, I went to graduate school because I liked teaching and because I wanted a community. And before going to school, I had made some friends in photography and met some people, but I didn't have a real map of what a larger photo community was or looked like. And after a few years of working and meeting people there, the world felt like a different place when I came out. One total side note, but are any of you in grad school? Okay, so if you can volunteer to be the visiting artist coordinator. I don't know if you have that here, but the student who reaches out to other artists. So I wanted to move to San Francisco, but I didn't know anybody in San Francisco. But I volunteered for my department to be the visiting artist coordinator. And I invited every artist I knew from San Francisco, or knew of from San Francisco, to come to speak at Yale. And then when I got to Yale, I had a whole network of people. And through some of those people, I was able to publish my first book and have my first shows. So if you can do that job, do that job. Ever. Like, meeting other artists in the art world is the way in to everything else in the art world. It's a network. Right? Don't write to a gallery. Write to an artist who's represented by a gallery. And if they believe in you and they tell their gallerist, then the gallerist might believe in you too. I think it works that way. You're nodding, so I think it...
Gallerist.
Yeah, we have one gallerist confirming this thing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.